Good evening. Welcome to a webinar on a geopolitical perspective of the Biden and Yoon Summit. I am Simone Chun. I'm the moderator of tonight's webinar. I'm honored to be joined by three distinguished speakers, all of whom are well known within the community of progressive analysts, activists, and scholars nationally and internationally. Let me first introduce Tim Beale. He's a retired New Zealand academic who has published extensively on Asia with a particular focus on US imperialism and Korea and China. His publications include, among many, Korea and Imperialism, The Angler and Octopus, The Continuing Korean War in the Murderous History of Bombing in Line of Fire, The Korean Peninsula in the US-China Strategy, The Western Frontier, US Sanctions Against North Korea and China. And Tim's most recent publication includes a chapter in anthology, Sanctions as a War, Anti-Imperialist Perspective on American Geoeconomic Strategy. Thanks, Tim, for joining us. Another speaker is Gregory. He's on the board of directors of the Yasnovic Research Institute and a Korea Policy Institute associate, like myself. He's also a member of Korea's Solidarity Committee for Democracy and Peace, 참여연대. His most recent publication includes a chapter in anthology published, I believe, December 2021, Sanctions as a War, Anti-Imperialist Perspectives on American Geoeconomic Strategy. Thanks, Greg, joining us tonight. And our third speaker is KJ No. He's a brilliant peace activist, analyst, and scholar on the geopolitics of the Asian continent who writes for Counterpunch and Distant Voice, among many. And he's also, he's a prolific commentator and writer, and he's a special correspondent for KPFA Flashpoints on the pivot to Asia and Koreas and the Pacific. And thanks, KJ, for joining us tonight. The order of tonight's webinar is as follows. I'll make a brief background talk, and I did have prepared my own slides, so let me share that with you before I start mine. So I actually include the one slide of Noam Chomsky because he's agreed to participate in our third webinar in August. And the argument that he makes is, I think, is relevant. This is based on the interviews that I did several years ago, where he says that the relations between conservative right-wing regime in South Korea and its opposition to engagement with North. This is where he said the North Korean threat provides justification for the right-wing conservative regime in the South, and relaxation with North Korea would mean conservative losing power in the South. And also, Professor Chomsky also mentioned about the warnings about the US is sort of playing with the fire in his view. And also, you know, for us to learn that how the danger of, although it sounds almost unthinkable, how the danger of a nuclear war that will end everything. So I'll keep you posted when we have the webinar date set up. For my part, because I want to give more time for the speakers, I just want to mention those four highlights from the Biden and Yoon joint statement, which I looked at. It was not at all a serious policy proposal that can ease tensions, but it is rather escalating tensions. It was not at all peacemaking. So I think that our team and Greg and the KJ will go more in detail and also give more rich detailed and views. So what I want to point out, those 4 points, takeaways. One, based on my analysis or my view, the Biden and Yoon joint statement shows that it's going to increasing potential for nuclear conflicts in the Korean Peninsula. Specifically, I would like to point out that according to their joint statement, President Biden affirms the US extended deterrence commitment to the ROK using the full range of US defense capabilities, including nuclear, conventional, and missile defense capabilities. So here I highlight nuclear. As far as I know, no previous US-ROK joint statement ever mentioned nuclear capabilities in their joint statement. So I think that in my view, this is pretty one step up escalation. And I also think that this should be considered for us to concerned about. The second takeaway from the joint statement is that expanding scope and scale of US-ROK joint military exercises. So what it means is, as you know, President Yoon has requested when he was running for when he was doing the campaign, full-scale live fire drills in the upcoming US-Korea joint military exercise. As you know, there are two annual major exercises. Under President Moon, we, in part because of pandemic, there was no full-scale live fire drill joint military exercises. They were all a computer simulation. But Yoon wanted to go back to the full-scale, which is, again, I feel that this is a significant escalation, especially from the hawkish new president, who doesn't have much experience foreign policy, let alone knowledge. And Yoon, as you recall, also favors the permanent rotational deployment of US strategic assets. Now, when we say US strategic asset, this means the nuclear capabilities. And this was actually the same request that was made in 2016, then now the previously impeached and now pardoned Park Geun-hye, and US at the time rejected it. But again, you can see this sort of a continuity among these conservative president. And also, this is the joint agreement. Now they're going to resume regular meetings of the Extended Deterrence Strategy Consultation Group, EDSCG, to ensure the presence of US strategic assets. Again, emphasize nuclear asset. And also other points that we already know, Yoon, wanted to additional THAAD battery to South Korea, and he threatened with a preemptive strike on North Korea as part of enhancing deterrence against North Korea. So the takeaway is that Yoon is escalating, and also I believe the Biden administration also together is escalating the conflict. The third main takeaway that I see from joint statement is that pushing Seoul into a US-ROK-Japan trilateral alliance, which is not new, but again, in view of the fact that the Yoon administration is pretty much diehard pro-Japan, pro-US, and this is going to be what they're heading is to trilateral military alliance, which I think KJ is going to talk more about it. And the fourth point is, this is something new. What I see is that Seoul's subordination of both national and economic security to Washington's interest. Now, here the new point is this. Before, South Korea has at least sort of a semblance of separating economic security and military security, national security. They wanted to be more autonomous and pursue national interests when it comes to economic issue. Now, if you look at the joint statement, they're going to create sort of economic working group to coordinate South Korea and United States economic policy, which will be linked to Washington's National Security Council. Now, this is, to me, it's new. And this almost reminds me you recall the working group they created right after two inter-Korean agreements, and also US DPRK Singapore agreement. And at the time, what happened was this working group, really US, Washington and Seoul working group, really played the role of sabotaging those agreements. So I think that this is to me, it's new. And the fact that South Korea is more integrated, not only national security, but also economically, they're trying to be depending on the US national strategy. I think to me, it's also alarming. And another that mentioned there is that joint statement is, of course, the one that, you know, South Korea is now officially decide to join the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. Those are my 4 points that I see from the joint statement, and it is not peacemaking and but escalating tensions. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause here and stop sharing my screen, and we'll go to Tim, and he's going to focus on Korea's policy, especially in the context of China and US competition and rivalry. Tim.
So following on from Simone, I'm just going to concentrate on China, the Chinese dimension behind the summit and behind the whole relationship between the Korean Peninsula, if you like, and the United States. Working. There we are. Okay, so if you think of challenges to US hegemony, there's Russia, of course. So we have the Ukraine war, but we have Russia as a main contestant, a main challenge to the United States. We have a variety of other countries, North Korea, DPRK, Iran, Syria, etc., etc. We also have, and this is quite interesting, a sort of a wide and fluctuating band of either neutral states, wavering states. India, we're not quite sure if India is formally in the Quad, but is it really in the Quad? India has taken a different line on Ukraine than what the Americans wanted, etc., etc. And now, of course, we have a new government in Australia. So that's probably not going to make very much difference, but it might. But China, of course, China is the main challenge, and it's the focus of this webinar. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. Now, China's challenge. What is China's challenge? Why is the United States so worried about China? Well, the challenge is multifaceted. Whereas the challenge from the Soviet Union was rather more unidimensional, China is multifaceted. There's the economic challenge. First of all, China has grown, the Chinese economy has grown so fast. It's now the largest in the world in purchasing power parity terms. It's overtaking the United States in other measures as well. Internationally, you have things like the Belt and Road. So you have this big program of infrastructure investment, building railways, building ports, doing all the sorts of things that Britain and the United States were doing in the 19th century and into the 20th century for their own purposes. There are considerable differences, but they're not doing much of this anymore. It's the Chinese who are building the railways and the ports and so forth. You get the things like the high-speed rail. China has most of the high-speed rail in the world. United States, as far as I know, hasn't really got any. In terms of technology, we get various measures that China is overtaking the United States. Number of patents issued. Huawei is a good example. Huawei and 5G, which is why the American government has taken all sorts of measures against Huawei because it can't compete. Artificial intelligence, etc., etc., etc. So many fields where Chinese technology is sort of moving ahead very fast and challenging the United States. On the political, societal level, things are a bit different. COVID is an interesting example, and the pandemic is not over. So far, as we know, China has done much better than the United States. The United States has had 1 million deaths, and China just a few thousand. But things are a bit in the balance at the moment with Omicron. But if China comes through this, will be a great sort of boost for the Chinese model, if you like, of how to run societies. And then we have the military challenge. Now, of course, the Chinese military is much weaker than the US in budget terms, military expenditure, in the weapons it's got, and especially in terms of reach. So the United States can attack China with conventional weapons, but the Chinese can't attack the United States. And this, of course, really goes for all countries in the world. The United States can attack them. They can't retaliate, except with in the few cases where they have nuclear weapons. Now, so America's response to all of this is basically fairly militaristic. You have rhetoric about investment in infrastructure, education, etc., etc., etc. But the reality is a weaponization of all these issues, a weaponization, for instance, of economics. So instead of the United States being able to compete with China with products, new products, etc., 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 it's using various forms of political measures, sanctions, decoupling, trying to decouple from the Chinese economy, building up new supply chains so it doesn't have to go through China and so forth. So instead of competing in classical terms, it's weaponizing. Now, of course, America's got a huge number of strengths, the military strength. More interesting, I think, is the information warfare dimension. The United States dominates much of the world's media. If you look at the coverage of the Ukraine war and compare that with coverage of other wars, the difference is astounding. Although it's important to realize that this hasn't carried out throughout the whole world. There's been quite a bit of resistance in Africa, Latin America, India, and so forth. But even so, it does dominate the world media in ways that no other country does. And American propaganda is much better than anyone else's. And it has a big reservoir of a legacy reservoir of soft power, think of Hollywood, etc., etc., etc. The innovation, most of the new products in my lifetime, and that's quite a long time now, have come from the United States. And it's traditionally had a can-do spirit. So it's been a forward-thrusting, growing, optimistic country. But it also has an empire, and that's terribly important. It has this hierarchy of subordinate countries, a very complicated hierarchy, but South Korea is one of the most important. And that, of course, takes us to this recent summit. So the American empire, American imperialism is a key factor. Now, I'm going to concentrate, just focus on one particular writer, because this is far too complicated, and no doubt Simone is already looking at her watch. Elbridge Colby, WASP, produces, done various things, but it produces this particular book, Statute of Denial, last year. And what I'm going to do is utilize a couple of reviews, which are accessible basically to well, the first one anyway, monthly review is open, is free for everyone to access. So this review by Lawrence Shoup, he gives a lot of information about Colby himself, about the Council on Foreign Relations, etc., as well as about the actual book. And then this article by Kai Prestovich in the Washington Post, and there's the URL, and no doubt there are ways of getting around that and getting a copy. And you'll see here from the heading of the article that Prestovich, following Colby, sees the key ignition point is Taiwan. Right, so why Colby? You know, he is a Republican, so he's got no official role in the Biden administration. Shoup describes his influence. Most of his ideas, not all of them, but most of them are widely shared within the establishment. And as we go through, I'll say which ones are and which ones aren't. And what really caught my attention was the eerie parallels with the Ukraine war. We'll see that in a moment. Okay, so as I see it, he's making four main points. First, only a bloody nose war will stop the rise of China. 2, that war should be over there, nowhere near America, over there. A precipitating war. There's a need to get China to fire the first shot. So it looks like that China is the aggressor, and allies are the key. We're coming back to the empire, and he has what he calls a binding strategy. Okay, only a bloody nose war will stop the rise of China. Now, a bloody nose war, as I see it, is where you give someone an adversary a bloody nose, they're hurt, but they're not demolished. They can walk away. They can go and fight someone else or do something else. They don't have to fight to the death. So they accept defeat and they walk away. And interestingly enough, Pearl Harbor, from the Japanese perspective, I think was an attempt to give the United States a bloody nose, and it didn't work. And that's one of the problems with Colby's thesis, that bloody nose wars don't necessarily work. You have to consider the context. And I'm not the only person who doesn't believe that. The whole idea is contested by many people within the American elite. Some argue that China's rise can be stopped by other means, by decoupling, by the Indo-Pacific economic framework, business, all that sort of stuff, but also because it's too dangerous. Colby is saying war can be limited. They're saying no, war can't be limited. And in fact, there was an article in Foreign Affairs just 2 days ago saying that any war over Taiwan with China could very easily move into a nuclear war. So there's a URL for that. And of course, it might be China that gives the United States a bloody nose. So there are all sorts of reasons why Colby is a bit of an outsider on this, although I suspect he's saying things that lots of people within the establishment think but don't dare say. Right, this is much easier. The war should be over there. There was a famous conversation between Trump and Lindsey Graham in 2017, and that's the quote: if there's going to be a war to stop Kim Jong-un, it will be over there. If thousands die, they're going to die over there. They're not going to die here. Now, nothing new about that. This is what America's been doing since 1812. My colleagues will have much better grasp of American history than I will, but 1812, the British burnt Washington. Was the last time that a foreign country has been able to actually land or inflict damage onto the continent, onto the United States, apart from 9/11. It's a slightly different case. So the United States has the blessings of geography. It's girded by these giant oceans on either side, but its adversaries aren't, and that's very important. So both Russia and China have American forces on their doorstep, but it doesn't work the other way around. There are, of course, disadvantages to that, long supply lines, etc. And that's quite important in East Asia or against China, because China is a pretty large and powerful country. But anyway, there's a general agreement, I think, amongst in the American establishment that a war with Russia should be in Europe, Ukraine, anywhere in Europe, as long as it's in Europe. As long as it's not anywhere near the United States, and war with China should be in East Asia. So that means South China Sea, Taiwan, or even Korea. So that's something we can discuss. Now, the next point is precipitating war. This is quite interesting. This brings up parallels with the Ukraine. Now, Pressovitz, this is how he describes it. It says, indeed, they should do everything possible to ensure that the onus of starting and continuing a war falls on Beijing, which would serve to strengthen the binding between the allies. Colby cites Abraham Lincoln's genius in maneuvering the South Carolina rebels into firing the first shots at Fort Sumter that started the Civil War. This put the onus of war and destruction on the Confederacy and vastly strengthened the support for the war in the northern states. So if you can do it, it's quite a good idea. So China must be put in the position of the first to fire and invade. And this is Pressovich again, such aggressive behavior will bind the allies more tightly together and thereby widen and deepen the front that Beijing must conquer. And so we have these examples. He mentions Fort Sumter. Pearl Harbor could be yet another one. Many people do suggest that Pearl Harbor was sort of deliberately set up by Roosevelt and his clique to get the United States into the war. So it seems as if the Japanese were firing first, but in fact, if you look at the context, the story might be murkier than that. And the same goes with Ukraine. Right. And then I think this is his last point. Allies are the key. It's what he called the binding strategy, binding the allies to the United States. We have the importance and necessity of allies. And so there's two questions: the importance, and then how to bind them to America's purpose. Allies have become much more important than they were in the past. They've always been important for the United States. You think of the Korean War. Americans brought troops from around the world. So there's nothing particularly new. But in terms of a war with China, China has local military superiority. So the United States needs both core allies and new ones. We have the core allies: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, though I think Australia is still there as a core ally. And then the new ones are trying to get India in. You've got the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, etc., etc., and that's by no means guaranteed to the United States. So they're working on it. It's a work in progress. And then further out on the wish list, there's global NATO, bringing in the Europeans to fight China. So that's a very worrying new development. And what nobody mentions, too polite to mention, that Allied widows don't vote in US elections. In other words, allies will bear most of the human and economic costs of any war with China, unless it's a nuclear war, just as in the case of Ukraine, it is Ukraine, Russia, but Ukraine is losing, is being demolished, is losing lives, etc., not the United States. So it's happening over there. So this is, from the point of view of American imperialism, obviously very desirable. The question is how you do it. Shope quotes Colby, and this is quite an interesting point. He says the key point here is how to maneuver China through deliberate action into appearing extremely threatening to coalition members. China must not be allowed to precipitate and fight a war over Taiwan or the Philippines in a manner that makes it seem insufficiently threatening to the other regional nations' vital interests. The United States must therefore prepare, posture, and act to compel China to have to conduct its campaign in ways that indicate it is a greater and more malign threat, not only to the state it has targeted, but to the security and dignity of the other states that might come to its defense. Now, it's worth thinking about. The question is, can the US achieve this conjuring check? Well, I think probably not. But they did it in Europe with the Ukraine war. We've got Sweden and Finland joining NATO. On the face of it, very strange thing to do, but so it has been done in Europe. Australia in the past has said it would fight alongside the US over Taiwan under the previous Morrison government. It's very keen to do that. Japan has made noises, but Japan is ambiguous. It's got its own fish to fry. And then we have the question of South Korea. So we're coming back, in a sense, to the Yoon Summit. And here we are. Does Yoon need binding to Biden? Apologize for the pun, but I couldn't resist it. Now, personally, he seems keen. In terms of all his talk, he appears very keen to do whatever Biden wants, to sacrifice South Korea's interests, for the United States, etc., etc. But rhetoric, of course, is not action. And in the background, we have these limits to presidential power, and others will know much more about it than I do, but it seems to me there's at least two potential restraints here. One's military. Vietnam, as you know, Vietnam was a very important war for South Korea in the Park Chung-hee period, but from the point of view of South Korea, it was a turkey shoot. The Vietnamese couldn't retaliate against Korea, but of course, war over Taiwan is war with China is quite a different matter. And then we have the chaebol, and this whole business of decoupling from China is sort of economic suicide, and war is worse. So there must be lots of concern within other power centers in South Korea about this program. Then we have the summit, well, as Simone said, pushes South Korea further into the US coalition against China, and that is very, very important. All sorts of unanswered questions: how far, how fast, how fatal. I think there are too many uncertainties for a definitive answer at the moment. But one thing, unfortunately, we can be sure about is that Yoon is taking South Korea down a road that promises no benefits for South Korea, but only danger and economic pain.
Thank you so much, Tim, for such a comprehensive and critical analysis. And it's truly the idea that, as far as some American concerned, as long as the word spot over there, not on American soil, it's really horrific. And the last point, a slide about South Korea's now more pretty much kind of abandoning its surveillance position. In fact, after Yoon Summit, after they celebrated how great Yoon did and what amazing ironclad alliance, if you read South Korean report, business already raising concern. Remember, 30% of Koreans export to relying to China, and those especially with this joining this American-led anti-China economic bloc, South Koreans, the effect on South Korea's small, medium-sized industry, it will be devastating. So I think that it will be very interesting to see what their reactions are. So thanks again, Tim, for the analysis, and we'll reserve for now the Q&A for later. Now let's go to Greg for as our next speaker.
As Simone pointed out, a big part of the Yoon-Biden summit was to direct the alliance in a more harder stance towards North Korea. And they both promised to expand the size and scope of military exercises that have threatened North Korea. So I think there will be no progress on any negotiated settlement, to say the least, during Yoon's term in office. But I think the primary goal that Biden had in mind in visiting South Korea and Japan right now is to expand the anti-China alliance. So basically, he has in mind a two-pronged attack on China. So there's a military encirclement that he certainly wants to tighten. And then there's the economic war, which I'll get to in a little bit. So right now, Christmas has come early for the Biden administration. This is Washington's moment. The Ukraine war is basically a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, as the Biden administration sees it, to more thoroughly impose global domination and to get allies more firmly in line to support its policies. So a long time now, the US has endeavored to encircle Russia and China. Military encirclement is essentially complete and has been for a while, as you can see on this map here with the military bases surrounding China and Russia. The challenge for the US then is how do you tighten the noose when you already have your bases about as tight as they can get? Well, one way is to expand allies to participate in tightening the noose. And so as we've Tim mentioned, you have Finland and Sweden have pledged to join NATO. And now with Yoon in office, he's more willing to go along with the US on its encirclement of China, it appears. So in the Ukraine war, the US is encouraging Ukraine to go for a total victory rather than a negotiated settlement. The goal is to prolong the war, to give economic sanctions time to bring about Russia's economic collapse. As far as attacking China economically, the US sees the election of Yoon as changing the US-China power dynamics. He's pro-US and anti-China, and that helps to build up the alliance against China. So, as you see here, Yoon's statements at the summit is totally unambiguous. You know, the US sees the Republic of Korea as participating not just in protecting the southern part of the Korean Peninsula, but participating in a global and comprehensive strategic alliance. And they discuss specific actions to further that end. And that second quote there is no surprise. It's like a dream come true for Biden. He's got Moon out of office, who he had to kind of strong arm to go along with him. With Yoon, he doesn't have to try at all. Yoon will go along with everything. So Biden's favorite pet phrase is "America's back." He's fond of repeating that, and it's basically amounts to his belief that U.S. allies are just longing for U.S. to give orders and tell them what to do. So as he says, the Indo-Pacific strategy document, Biden's document there, is going to focus on every corner of the Asia-Pacific region. And the U.S. is going to try to dominate the entire region. And as he sees it, the security alliances and partnerships with the allies are key to making that happen. Yeah, let me quote one more thing from that document. It also says that we recognize that American interests can only be advanced if we firmly anchor the United States in the Indo-Pacific and strengthen the region itself alongside our closest allies. And the American role in the region must be more enduring than ever. So this is basically a call for total domination of the entire region. Now, South Korea's role in the alliance. Anthony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, they had an editorial in the Washington Post some time back, and where they said that there's going to be a big push to revitalize our ties. And in other words, the alliances, and that certainly includes South Korea especially, are what the military calls force multipliers. So that is, so like the South Korean military is basically to strengthen the US military's efforts, whatever it pursues. And again, they're calling for the South Korean military and to play an increasingly global role. So, you know, this, again, South Korean military is seen as being situated to participate in whatever action the United States may care to take outside of the peninsula. And basically, Korea pays expenses for military that in practical terms is basically supposed to serve as an extension of the US military. So now the joint statement by Biden and Yoon explicitly calls out for confrontation with China as an arena for Korean cooperation with the US military. Korea is expected to support US warships sailing in Chinese territorial waters as a means of trying to provoke an incident. Korea is also expected to back any incident or conflict that the US provokes with China over Taiwan. It's clear that the US sees Taiwan as the most promising avenue for creating a crisis with China. So this, I think, is the first time that any Korean and US agreement mentioned specifically the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. If I remember correctly, the last statement with the Moon administration deliberately left that out, although Japan did include those. Of course, South Korea's proximity to China makes this, this approach rather dangerous for the Korean people. The US population, as Tim pointed out, is geographically quite safe from harm. The Korean population is not. Now, there is a stumbling block in the US ambition to create a US, Korea, Japan trilateral alliance. The US sees that as the cornerstone of its policy anti-China campaign. But Imperial Japan's wartime practice of forcing or tricking women to sexual slavery is unresolved. And nor has there been any resolution to the issue of Koreans who were conscripted into forced labor to work at factories in Japan during World War II. The 2015 compensation agreement between Japan and South Korea failed to address the issue of whether coercion was a policy of Imperial Japan. Furthermore, the comfort women themselves were not consulted on the agreement. And surprisingly, part of that agreement, South Korea agreed to refrain from public criticism of Japan over the issue. This is a historical issue. It's basically saying you agree, we're not going to talk about what happened in history, we'll pretend it didn't happen. And South Korea in that 2015 agreement also promised to take steps towards removing statues that commemorated the victims. This was no resolution whatsoever, no matter what Japan says about it. And many people in Korea are uncomfortable with a close military alliance with Japan for precisely these historical factors. However, as you see in that last quote, Yoon is inclined to just sweep all that under the rug. And in the bottom bullet point, Yoon's foreign minister met with the Japanese foreign minister, and they're basically going to prioritize their collaboration with each other in service to the United States. Okay, so now NATO moves east. It was inevitable. NATO has already played a role in Asia because it supported the US military operations in Afghanistan. So this is just moving a little farther out east and to encompass basically the whole globe. That's the ambition. And of course, as you may recall, NATO also bombed Libya in 2011. So it's nothing new for NATO to operate in out-of-area war making. NATO now says it's not looking for Asia-Pacific nations to join as member states, but it will instead work with them as partners. At the NATO summit in Madrid in June, which as you see, these 4 countries, including South Korea, have been invited to attend. NATO plans to adopt a new strategic concept. So NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg said that the new concept will address security consequences of a much stronger China. Stoltenberg also says that areas of cooperation with the Asia-Pacific partners will include cyber operations and maritime security, because, as he puts it, global challenges demand global solutions. So again, we're looking at a worldwide NATO with Korea playing its part. And here you see again some quotes. NATO is going to come out with a very strong anti-China statement at its summit in next month, because China is engaging in normal economic trade outside of the Asia-Pacific. NATO puts it, it's coming closer to us. So therefore, NATO must militarily come closer to China. China's coming economically closer to Europe, but NATO's coming militarily closer to China. So here we see some more quotes from Stoltenberg, again, making it very clear of the aim of NATO is to target China more directly than it ever has before. And again, I think the goal is to create this fiction of a global coalition against China, the way that right now we're seeing the attempt to create a global coalition against Russia as a united front. Basically, this kind of corresponds to the term international community, which in fact represents several thousand people at the top tiers of power in the US and Western Europe and excludes the vast majority of the world's population. But terms of a coalition or international community, they create this fiction that sells very well to present an image of a united front in support of US imperialism against whatever enemy it chooses to target. So now South Korea has taken its first step. And as you see here, they've signed up to be the first Asian member of the cyber defense group that NATO runs. And actually, this was signed just a few days before Yoon even took office. So one wonders exactly what South Korea's role is going to be, and if it's going to be confined to this cyber defense, or what else it might be asked to do. At NATO's 2018 summit, NATO decided to employ the full range of cyber capabilities, by which they meant both defensive and offensive activities. Now, this cyber defense group that South Korea has joined is ostensibly only for cyber defense activities. It's not for offensive activities, or at least that's how the official verbiage reads. But again, as I mentioned at the 2018 summit, they were talking about adding offensive activities. So as one high-ranking military official put it, who attended that summit, said, speaking at NATO about offensive cyber was blasphemy a few years ago. We have advanced. In other words, it's no longer defense only. And NATO declared that it won't seek offensive cyber capabilities on its own. Instead, it's going to rely on the capabilities of member states that volunteer to carry out offensive cyber attacks on NATO's behalf. And it was reported that the 2018 summit that 5 nations, including the United States, had agreed to be the volunteer nations to carry out cyber attacks on behalf of NATO. Now, that is not to say that South Korea, as a partner, will necessarily engage in offensive cyber attacks in support of NATO, but it can't be excluded that we'll be asked to do so. And I don't see Yoon as being a man to say no to the United States. I just don't see that. Now, the second leg of Biden's confrontation with China is, as Tim mentioned, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was officially launched today as it happens. So ostensibly, the purpose is to address supply chain disruptions through diversification. In reality, the intent is to cut China out of the supply chain, not only for the United States, but also for Asia-Pacific nations. So it's hard to say how replacing one supply chain with another is going to diversify the supply chain and how it's going to add resilience. You're just replacing one with the other, and you're starting from zero or near zero. So again, this IPF is not a China +1 approach, but it's an exclusion. So as you see with these 2 quotes from the US ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, it's very clear that China is not invited to the party, so to speak. And again, that was underlined by US Trade Representative Catherine Tai, who said that the IPF is an arrangement independent of China. Since US businesses are increasingly unsure they can compete on equal footing with Chinese competition, given the rapid expansion of the Chinese economy, the goal of the IPF is to create a closed system in the Asia Pacific, whereby Chinese competition is excluded altogether, and US business interests can dominate. US officials point to the supply chain disruptions as being due to COVID-19 as a justification for the program, but the plans to cut China out of the global supply chain predate the outbreak of COVID-19. Also, the current disruptions are not entirely due to the pandemic. Much of this is self-induced on the part of the United States. So for instance, this trade war against China has created a good deal of turmoil in international trade, and Biden has kept in place tariff hikes and bans on investments of several Chinese companies. Also, the US restrictions on Huawei compelled the company to purchase as many semiconductors as it possibly could, while it could, before the restrictions closed off its access altogether. And their hurry to grab as many semiconductors as they could helped to contribute to the global shortage. Another contributing factor was a drought in Taiwan, as the semiconductor production requires a tremendous amount of water supply. So now this is basically an economic war. US officials are visiting American companies who operate in Asia and pressuring them to boycott various Chinese partners. They have recently expanded that effort and are now trying to force non-US companies to join a blockade on Chinese technology. So they're actually making person-to-person visits to these companies and trying to strong-arm them. Now, what does what does South Korea have to gain by participating in the IPEF? If you look at the trade partners of Korea, both export and import side, it's self-destructive, clearly. China's its leading trade partner by far. The US trails well behind. It appears that, of course, Yoon seems to expect that South Korea is going to replace China in the technological trade with the United States. But that's not going to be enough to make up for the damage that's done to its economy. In essence, it's an attempt to oppose an economic blockade on one's main trading partner. It doesn't make any sense from a self-interested standpoint. And one wonders, is Yoon prepared to deal with the public displeasure at the economic disruption that this policy could cause? I wonder. Now, is the IPEF realistic? So the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai did a survey of a number of businesses who are in China, operating in China. And 72% of these businesses said they have no plan to move any production from China in the next 3 years. Less than 2% plan to move production completely out. In fact, nearly half of the companies that the American Chamber of Commerce questioned, nearly half of them actually increased their investment in China over the last year. And it must be also pointed out that there's more than 1 million foreign companies operating in China. If the US thinks that it can basically force all these companies out of China, it's a monumental task that I just don't see as being realistic. I think, maybe US efforts can hurt China, but I don't think it can cut China out of the international trade whatsoever. Furthermore, business has significant costs associated with leaving China. The nation has a very well-organized infrastructure and a skilled labor force. The proximity of partner operations means that components can be provided to a factory very rapidly. Indeed, one business owner who moved operations from China to Vietnam said, in the past, it would take only 2 hours to mobilize the delivery of components from other Chinese provinces. Now, it takes at least 1 to 2 weeks of waiting time as the supply chain becomes decentralized outside of China. But basically, the IPEF has the potential of creating absolute havoc on the international market to the degree of whatever success the United States meets. So now China, how is China responding? So they keep arguing for a win-win approach. There's no reason for this zero-sum approach where the United States wants to dominate the other partner. Foreign Minister Wang Wenbin said the US is politicizing and weaponizing economic issues and coercing regional countries to take sides. It is deliberately creating economic decoupling, technological blockade, and industrial chain breakage. Despite the US trade war and attempts to drive economic partners away from doing business with China, foreign direct investment in China is continuing to rise. So the trajectory is actually going in the opposite direction of US efforts. But China cannot afford to be blocked from access to semiconductors. It'd be ruinous for them. So it's launched its own program to become self-sufficient in production. And last year, China's rate of production of integrated circuits doubled in comparison to the year before. So it's estimated that in 2 years' time, China will rank 3rd in global sales of microchips. So you have to move fast because the US is going to try everything possible to block their access to semiconductors. So even though China's ramping up production of semiconductors, where it's lagging behind is in the higher end chips. It hasn't really gotten very far in that effort. So now there was recently a meeting between the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations and the United States. And Biden promised to provide $150 million in aid to those 10 nations. That works out to an average of $15 million per nation. It's a pittance. In fact, looked at another way, among the member states, there are 650 million people. And that works out to a total of $4.33 per person. It's not what one would call transformational. Moreover, so Biden thinks that he can bribe ASEAN nations with this pittance of money, whereas ASEAN and China are each other's leading trade partners. Of course, that's why the US is targeting them. The largest distribution of money, moreover, out of these $150 million that Biden has promised, the largest component of that is $60 million to, as the US puts it, promote a free and open Indo-Pacific. Those are code words for anti-China confrontation. The money will go to deploying US Coast Guard assets and personnel in the Asia Pacific. It will also be used to conduct military exercises. In other words, this is not aid to the ASEAN. This is self-serving aid. It's aid to the United States military. Indeed, it goes directly against the interests of the Southeast Asian nations and ramps up confrontation with China, which is the last thing they need. So let's contrast that with what China has pledged to the ASEAN. They promised $1.5 billion for pandemic control and economic recovery. And China is also delivering 150 million COVID-19 vaccine doses and has also promised to provide advanced technology. There's absolutely no comparison. So where do we go from here? Obviously, the US is expecting South Korea to play a leading role in backing it up on whatever confrontations it wants to create. And that puts Korean progressives on the front line of resistance. Now, if you will indulge me, I sent a link to a video to Hyun, and I'd like to end on an upbeat note and have him play a 1-minute clip from that video, and it demonstrates the fighting spirit of Korean progressives. This particular clip is taken from a demonstration at the Hyatt Hotel in Seoul, where President Biden was staying. So these demonstrators are sending a very direct message of what they think of Biden's plan to militarize their nation and put that in the middle of a confrontation with China. So Hyun, that video, it loops around. So after 1 minute, it'll just loop the beginning and stop it at that point. So I'll try and stop sharing my screen here.
We can play another time. By the way, Greg, thank you so much for the thorough and comprehensive analysis.
One moment, just a quick note to everybody. I'll just put a link to the entire video in the chat and people can watch it.
Yes, that'll be awesome. Okay. Yeah, perfect. Anyway, I can't believe that we had only 1 week of notice and preparation, but Greg, my goodness. Oh my God. Thank you so much. And it's just, the idea that anti-China coalition is a fiction. I agree with you. And also, as far as Korea concerned, I think you made a very compelling case. I hope President Yoon watches your presentation. It is a self-destructive for South Korea to abandon this balanced diplomacy approach, and it's not for South Korea's economic interest, for that matter, interest of American consumers as well. And I just read that according to the latest op-ed piece from Responsible Statecraft, anti-China coalition, any war with China will basically cause the worst financial crisis that we have ever experienced, and overall effect could decrease, after we talk American GDP by up to 10%. So I think it is not interest for anybody. So it's a fictional. I think we should stop it. Okay, without further ado, let's go to finally KJ.
Thank you. So I'm very honored to be with this august company of experts. I would like to share very briefly on what is happening from a larger geopolitical standpoint, as I feel that that's essential for understanding this. So my key point is that the United States is escalating to war in China, as others have pointed out, and South Korea is a key element of this escalation. If you look at this picture, I don't know if people recognize this. Does anybody recognize the picture? It's the lawmaker Kim Moo-sung. Behind him is Curtis J. Scaparotti, who was the CNC USFK UNC commander at the time. You can see that Kim Moo-sung is actually giving him a piggyback ride. And I think this is just a very visible and obvious metaphor of how South Korea is a client state of the United States. And Donald P. Gregg, the ambassador at the time, even went so far as to say our relationship to Korea has historically been that of patron to client. So Yoon's meeting with Biden can be seen as more of the same. It's a ritual or a ceremony of obeisance. And this is happening, as I said, as Biden is preparing for war with China. Yoon essentially offered Biden's foreign policy back to him on a silver platter, in particular in the economic and military dimensions. So as Greg said, this is early Christmas in Washington. Now you can look at the actual statements, and a lot of it is word salad, and a lot of it is very coded language. But we can summarize that it will result in enhanced or escalated nuclear deterrence, and it's also reversion to CVID, which will result in increased tensions. There'll be increased military exercise and coordination as usual, as we anticipated. And there is an explicit and comprehensive but coded participation of South Korea in United States war against China, which is now named the Indo-Pacific Strategy, in all war-fighting domains and in all potential conflict areas, South China Sea, Taiwan, etc. They also mention a cyber warfare collaboration, the inclusion of the cyber domain, economic warfare through the IPEF, tech warfare, and collaboration or enmeshment of the defense sector supply chain and production, escalation in space warfare, ideological warfare, commitments to fighting against China in Taiwan and the South China Sea, and of course, an alliance with Japan through what I refer to as JACAS, or Japan, Korea, US Trilateral Alliance. Key to note is what the US calls cooperation is bloc forming and enclosure, and resilience also is a euphemism for enclosure. I want to point out that the fat is frying in the pan, and what we're seeing as an early signal of this is random rage killings of Asians, that mass killings of Asians over there is signaled by the random rage killings of Asians over here. We see an epidemic of attacks. This has nothing to do with Trump. In fact, they increased after Trump left and outside of the Trumposphere. And essentially a wholesale policy of hate mongering trickles down into retail violence. Asians are and will be collateral damage. So this summit signals, in my opinion, declaration of hybrid war against China. When I talk about hybrid war, it's a multi-domain warfare, and it's not simply military, but economic, cyber, diplomacy, information warfare, etc. That is, we conceive of warfare in multiple domains, 5 or 6 separate domains, and all domains are contested. And this includes military, but also political, economic, social, informational, cyberspace. Specifically, if we look at China, we can see economic and financial warfare, tech war, legal warfare, diplomatic warfare, military brinksmanship, civil subversion, academic warfare, for example, the FBI's China initiative. And we can also ask ourselves, why is the US at war with China? And it boils back down to Martin Luther King's three evils, militarism, materialism, and racism, or empire, capitalism, and racism. There's a very definitive history to it. It starts in 1992, continues up to the current moment. Andrew Marshall was a key person who was responsible for some of this formulation. He had multiple acolytes who continued his worldview. I think you may recognize some of these people. And of course, Kagan and Victoria Nuland in the left-hand corner are very, very important. Andrew Krapinovich was an acolyte of Andrew Marshall. He was the person who worked out the nuts and bolts of actual warfare. And other ideologues stated that there is no hope of coexistence with China. Paul Wolfowitz is important because he wrote the Defense Planning Guidance document, which we refer to as the Wolfowitz Doctrine. It was a plan for total world domination. This became the Project for a New American Century. And then the Project for a New American Century became the Bush Doctrine, which became the pivot to Asia, enunciated by Hillary Clinton, but really architected by Kurt Campbell. It contains both a military doctrine, air-sea battle, as well as an economic warfare doctrine, which we refer to as the TPP. So once again, we can look at the Bush Doctrine, becomes the Obama Doctrine, becomes the Trump Doctrine, becomes the Biden Doctrine, which becomes the pivot to Asia, becomes the Indo-Pacific Strategy. And the economic dimension of that is called IPEF, or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Blue team, red team, these are all the kind of ideologues that continued. Taiwan is a key part of their agenda. They especially had a strong element of attacking China and undermining US normalization with China, and we'll revisit this in a moment. So the evolution starts with Heartland theory, goes to the grand chess game, becomes the Defense Planning Guidance document, becomes the Project for the New American Century, becomes the pivot to Asia, run out of the Center for New American Security. And then it becomes the Trump Doctrine, and it becomes the IPEF and the Indo-Pacific Strategy. This is a long time coming. So in specifically, the military doctrine has to do with the US doctrine of war. China is surrounded with 400 bases. In particular, you can see Japan, Guam, Australia, South Korea. And this creates a complete arc of encirclement. And in particular, we have what is called the first island chain. And you can see that Taiwan is dead center of the first island chain. It's the closest part to the Chinese continent, about 80 miles away. And some of the islands are actually 3-4 miles away, literally swimming distance. Kunsan, Osan, Jeju Island are also very important, as are the massive military presence on Japan and Okinawa. All of this is doctrine. It's not simply hypothetical. It's actually worked out in a doctrine called air-sea battle, which is actually simply a continuation of the US-NATO doctrine against the USSR, which is called air-land battle. And this was a deep battle extended in time and space using technology, integrated battle, and decentralized initiatives. And it was applied in theory and practice, in particular, all the wars after the Soviet Union, war with Soviet Union never happened, but all the US subsequent wars implemented the air-land battle doctrines. We also have to think about the third offset, which is the first offset is really mass, that is against Soviet superiority. The US contemplated the use of massive power, atomic weapons. When the Soviets created their own nuclear weapons, then the second offset against that was precision, that is cruise missiles that would knock out the missiles before they could be launched. And the third offset against precision is dispersion and automated warfare. So currently with Taiwan, what is being contemplated is dispersion and swarming. also long-range fires, full spectrum or hybrid warfare, subsurface warfare, which is why there's such a battle over submarines, for example, with AUKUS, and of course, autonomous warfare. So once again, we can look at the first island chain. Taiwan is the closest, but Korea is very, very important. The South China Sea is also important because it's the choke point. We can think of South Korea as being the nose, the Taiwan as being the chin, and the South China Sea as being the throat. If there were a war to happen, these would be the vulnerabilities. Taiwan province is important because it was a province of China, and in 1895 it was taken away by force as war booty as a result of the Sino-Japanese War, which was actually a war waged by China to prevent or to aid Korea against encroaching Japanese colonization. Geostrategically, it's critical because it's a pawn on the seventh row. It's so close to China. And like a pawn on the seventh row, if it makes one step forward, it can result in game in the end game. It's really the end of the game. And so this is why it's so important for China. The Shanghai Communique, which established relations between the United States and China, established the one China policy. The PRC is the legitimate government. There's only one China, and Taiwan is a province or a part of China. Official relations with the United States on the part of China is predicated on the US not weaponizing its own territory against it. This has been effectively discarded. The US has de facto discarded the one China policy. It has trampled on all the red lines, and it has prioritized the Taiwan Relations Act over the three communiques. The Taiwan Relations Act actually commits to giving Taiwan the means to defending itself. So the US is currently militarizing Taiwan. And what's especially interesting, but also ominous, is now the US is only authorizing the sale of asymmetric weapons to Taiwan. Before, it would sell all kinds of outdated or vanity military weapons to Taiwan. Now, it is only authorizing the sale of asymmetric weapons that can be used for distributed and dispersed and swarming tactics. So this, in my opinion, means that war is being very seriously prepared. And of course, I have to note that there is a trigger in Taiwan and a vicious cycle. That is, China has its own anti-secession law, which authorizes military action if there is foreign intervention. On the other hand, the Taiwan Relations Act defends Taiwan against military intervention. So we have a vicious cycle and a trigger already being set up. We note that just today, a strategic ambiguity over Taiwan is finished. That is to say, a reporter asked Biden, are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that? Biden said, yes. Reporter said, you are. Biden said, that's the commitment we made. And this is the third time that Biden has said that. Third time is the charm. Essentially, we have to understand that strategic ambiguity is over. The US is using Taiwan as a trigger for war with China. Japan-US trilateral alliance, or JACUS, is also an important part of it. The US cannot impose a top-down security architecture globally. And so it's trying to stitch together a bespoke set of minilateral alliances, a lattice work, that's the word that they're using. But JACUS, that is Korea and Japan, who are the most reliable client states of the United States with huge militaries, will do the heavy lifting. And Japan's remilitarization and South Korea's subaltern position, in particular the fact that it does not have sovereign control over its own military, is a very, very important part of the picture. JACUS is really, I see it as a shotgun wedding. In the agreement, Biden and Yoon talked about the importance of the ROK-US trilateral cooperation, blah, blah, blah. But essentially, it's what's been planned since Obama declared the pivot. Of course, there are problems with this because Japan needs to rewrite its violent history of colonialism. Japan took millions of POWs. It only returned 56 at the end of the war. That gives you a sense of how brutal Japan's war and colonization was. Took hundreds of thousands of comfort women, 75 to 90% who died during their enslavement. During the industrialization development of Manchukuo, historians have referred to it as the Manchurian Passage, simply because of the number of enslaved people whose death rates were comparable or higher than the Atlantic Passage. And I think certain historians have compared it to the Belgian Congo in terms of its violence and brutality. So Yoon has agreed to reinstate the 2015 agreement on the comfort women, which agreed to remove the statues and comes with a gag order around discussing the comfort women issue in public fora. And of course, the US mindset is simply, as Wendy Sherman put it, or I'm paraphrasing, the comfort women simply need to get over it. The pivot to Asia is one of the things that they mentioned. Yoon mentioned that the ROK would become a global pivot state. And this pivot state term is a reference to Obama's pivot to Asia. And just to explain that a little bit, this is a topological map of the world. You can see all of Eurasia and Africa is connected overland through land connections, and all of this can be connected through rail. The bottom third is the Americas, and the Americas are separate and it's relatively isolated. Oxford geographer Halford Mackinder said Eurasia could be considered the heartland or the pivot state. And he said that who rules Eurasia commands the heartland, who commands the heartland commands the world island, who rules the world island commands the world. And so this is the geostrategic understanding that if Eurasia unites and becomes predominant, this would take power away from the Atlantic and the Americas. This is incorporated into Brzezinski's grand chessboard. He says no Eurasian challenger should emerge that can dominate Eurasia and challenge US global preeminence. This becomes the defense planning guidance document, or the Wolfowitz doctrine. And then it becomes the pivot to Asia. And then it becomes the Biden doctrine, Indo-Pacific strategy. The US sees China as an existential threat to the rules-based order, et cetera, et cetera. There's tremendous public threat, inflation. It's a threat to, essentially, China is a all spectrum threat, which actually goes against the actual history. China has no kinetic conflict since 1979. It wants peaceful reunification with Taiwan, wants peaceful resolution of the South China Sea, and it wants win-win cooperation and mutual security. So China is not a threat. It's not a threat to your freedom. It's not a nuclear threat. It's not a threat to your lifestyle. It's certainly not a threat to Hillary Clinton's grandchildren. But it is, multipolarity itself is a threat because it gives a choice to the global South. It allows non-Western, non-capitalist development. It's an ideological threat in that it's a threat of a good example. It's a threat to the world capitalist system in the fact that $152 trillion was extracted from the global South since 1960. When that is interfered with, then that is a threat to Western capitalist dominance. And so the US does want to take down China in all domains. Escape from control threatens the West. And I make the analogy that the Korean War was a police action, which is comparable to the kind of extraordinary threat inflation and policing that the US does, both domestically and externally. And finally, I'll just finish off that a parasite sees a host's effort to free itself as an existential threat. But the host must realize that the parasite is attached to it. For peace on the peninsula, Korea needs to recover its independent sovereignty, needs to recover OPCON. There has to be de-escalation with North Korea, with China, and in Asia in general. It has to avoid participating in blocs, and it should work for mutual security and win-win. Because we know what war on the peninsula looks like. We have to work for peace. Despair is not an option. Thank you.
Thanks, KJ. This is super compelling and powerful and a little bit depressing presentation. And I think the last one of the last slides where you had what should be alternative. I think that's really I think a key point is time. It's critical that we take the path to de-escalation. And as you can see, I've been myself and probably everybody was very impressed by very thorough, rich, critical analysis. And I didn't really constrain time because each speaker had such a just in-depth knowledge, and I just I wanted us to benefit. But from the chat box, I see some question. Obviously, we are kind of running out of time, but there are some question and comment. There's a comment that there are those who appreciated KJ's, I think, a point that South Korea is a client state. And also related question will be, how can we get out of this being, in client state to United States? And second question and a comment was that a lot of progressive in Korea very right now is, in deep depression. There's a setback. So I think that, and also, so some Koreans asking, this was a question in Korean, YouTube live, what should be the strategy? What kind of strategy that progressive in Korea and also in the United States can do to contest? And this obviously is self-destructive path for all of us. I think that a question. And then there was another question. Oh, it was actually a very interesting question, which also I thought about myself. Do you, any of you happen to have any knowledge, inside knowledge about what Biden requested, wanted from Yoon, which was not reported in the media? I have some speculation. For instance, they might have said that, South Korea providing weapons to Ukraine via United States. So it wasn't, so there must have been something that wasn't in the media that if you have any information, you might be willing to share. So any of you maybe wanted to comment, any three of those questions or comment?
I'll say a quick word. The first thing I think is important is people have to understand that despair is not an option. We know from decades of study around trauma that if you do nothing, you will be permanently scarred and traumatized. People who take action, fight back, do something, come out in good shape. But if you just resign to passivity, you cannot break out of depression or trauma. And so with that understanding, the first thing is to understand the situation. You have to understand the information war that is happening right now, because we are currently in war and we're in the pre-kinetic or the sub-kinetic dimension of war, which is all about information warfare. So first we have to think critically. We cannot believe the mainstream media. We have to challenge its lies. We have to act and communicate to prevent that. And then we take actions, both small, local, but also large actions. Sometimes the larger action is easier than the smaller action in certain cases. So I invite people to think creatively about what are the ways that they can ally and challenge this, total full spectrum war, because as I said, we have to resist it. Regarding what Biden might have said to Yoon, we have to have a very good understanding that South Korea has always been a sidekick and a subaltern to US foreign policy, especially in the military dimension. When the US waged war against Afghanistan, the first country that sent troops, one of the first, was South Korea. 500 military officers were sent without knowledge of anybody else to Afghanistan almost immediately after the US sent its own troops into Afghanistan. During the Vietnam War, 320,000 troops, Korean troops, fought in the Vietnam War. And after 1972, the South Koreans were doing the bulk of the fighting. There were more South Koreans in Vietnam than Americans. So we have to understand that there was probably some kind of military request made. Certainly, there were very strong economic demands made, both tacitly and explicitly regarding supply chain resilience. And I think that, once again, South Korea will bear the brunt. It will be the spearhead of US militarism, as it has been over many, many decades. And that's something we have to completely and totally resist and challenge.
So despair is not an option, fight back. It just occurred to me, it's we haven't really talked much about North Korea. So I'm going to ask Tim and Greg, what do you think that policy, Biden's now, after this summit, Biden's North Korea policy, what do you think that North Korea's policy position will be? Both Greg and Tim, if you can predict.
From Biden's point of view, I don't think there's any great change. They want the status quo, they want the tension. I don't think the military is, I think they're dithering about the possibilities of war. War is dangerous, so they're not necessarily going to jump into war. So I think from the military point of view, there is this great continuity in American policy. The question is what North Korea can do about it. We've seen the tests, the ICBM tests. There was talk of a nuclear test, which doesn't appear to have happened yet. But the situation is changing in the sense that North Korea is now getting much more support, and not enough, but it's getting more support from China and Russia. They're refusing to enter into new sanctions in the United Nations Security Council and so forth. So there's some hope of restraint there, protection, if you like, for North Korea. But exactly what North Korea can do to force the United States into real peace negotiations to end the hostility policy, I don't know. I think we can hope they come up with something. I think the global situation is changing, but I see nothing very much happening in the short term. Back to you, Greg.
Yes, I'm pretty much in agreement with you. I think that North Korea recognizes that there's absolutely no possibility of productive negotiations with the United States as long as Yoon and Biden are in office. So basically, that hope is put on hold for the next several years. I think that they realize that they have to accelerate efforts to complete testing of their nuclear missile program. I don't think they need to conduct any more nuclear tests. I think they've got that mastered. The only part of the missile technology they've not mastered yet is the re-entry vehicle. So I think we might see some more ballistic missile tests until they feel comfortable that they've mastered the re-entry vehicle and they have a viable counterweight to any threats the United States might want to make.
Thank you. And any other question? Now, I know we are running over our time. I was actually going to this one quick last question because I think it's one of the very few actually rare webinars where we were able to get the macro political historical analysis and with the rich in detail. And there's some sense that from all three of you that, this war against China, it is imminent. There's this sense. But on the other hand, I don't know, I somehow still don't seem to be believing it, buying it. But Tim has always been some more always trying to, conservative to the extent that whenever we try to go more, believe in the escalation and heightened tension. Tim, what do you think? Do you think that really this war with China is imminent in Northeast Asia?
Well, obviously we hope not, because it would be catastrophic not merely for the region but for the world. I don't know. I think there are so many conflicting forces within the United States elite, and I don't think there's any real consensus on it. I think it might happen to some extent by accident. But at the moment, I think they're still dithering. They're still uncertain. It's on the one hand, there is the feeling that the only thing that's going to stop China is war or something close to it. On the other hand, it's hugely dangerous, and so I think things are going to be on hold. And I also think that the situation in Europe around Ukraine is also going to have an effect. So if it turns out that there is, and Americans are now talking about it, that Ukraine or Kiev will have to accept a peace agreement, that's going to put another dimension to a war with China. So there won't be a war with Russia. That will quieten down. But the war around Ukraine has demonstrated the limits of American power. So that's another constraining factor. So the short answer is I don't know the answer. I think at the moment I'm hopeful that if one might say the forces of sanity, the forces of cowardice or whatever will prevail, and that it won't go ahead. So don't forget, the United States has never gone to war, certainly in recent times, against a peer competitor, anybody that's actually dangerous for the United States. This will be a completely new stage. And even if you look at the two world wars, United States was secure behind its ocean and all that stuff, and it had powerful allies and so forth. So from the United States, the dangers were really very, very limited. But with China, going to war with China, that's quite different, and it could move forward either a local war which they don't win, which would be impact on their position, their global position considerably, or it could go to a nuclear war, and and that might be the end of us all. So at the moment, I think there's far too much uncertainty, but one hopes that sanity and fear and restraint and caution will prevail.
Thank you. Let's see, any other questions? Okay, so maybe maybe we can wrap up, and I appreciate very much, and I'm so impressed, and that I'm so grateful for all the amazing preparations and all those information slides and the very detailed review and critical analysis that I myself have benefited greatly. And just about going back to that the question, I think we focus so much about this geopolitical context, because which in itself says something about South Korea. And this time when South Korea is supposed to be taking actually rather independent and autonomous decision, is that Yoon administration, this new hawkish conservative administration, is taking the completely opposite path. And I think the good news is that it just Yoon just has begun. So I think that's where the hope is. It hasn't even barely started. So I think this is time for us, instead to be disappointed and dejected and depressed. This is the time that we need to fight back. We have to raise our voice, and I think that's as KJ mentioned. And one more final, because I mentioned earlier that we're going to have the third webinar in late summer, according to Professor Chomsky. I just wanted to relate to you, conversation that I had with him. He told me he was very sorry he couldn't join us, and then he said something like, "Well, I hope, I said nothing crazy happened between now and late summer," and he said that if that happened, we were talking about, something about, war, some major conflict with China. He said there will be the end. There will be the end. It's that just shows how important the issues that we are tackling here. And again, thank you so much for tonight's webinar, and it was great seeing you all. And thank all of you who participated and who joined in this evening. And I will see you in the next webinar. Good evening.
If I just may something
good night.
If I may say something real quick, no fight is ever lost unless one gives up. So keep fighting.
Thank you. Bye.